And now investigators are deploying new technology and analyzing other evidence, hoping for a breakthrough to bring Nancy home. Investigators are using a device known as a signal sniffer to try to detect signals from the 84-year-old's pacemaker.
There is a device inside Nancy Guthrie's chest that has been recording everything. Every heartbeat, every moment of elevated stress, every physiological change her body went through on the night she disappeared. All of it stored, all of it time-stamped, all of it sitting inside a small electronic device implanted in her chest that the FBI has been fighting to decode since the first week of February. And what they found inside that data is what this video is about. Here is what nobody has said clearly enough yet. If modern pacemakers are not just heart regulators, if they are data recorders that log, timestamp, track, and sync wirelessly with paired devices, that leave a trail of information which, in the right hands, with the right tools, can reconstruct a timeline of events that no camera, no witness, and no physical evidence could replicate with the same precision. What did Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker record during those 41 minutes between 1:47 when the camera went dark and 2:28 when the sync stopped? If the cardiac timeline shows a sudden acute elevation at 1:47, precisely synchronized with the moment the doorbell camera was disabled, consistent with the physiological response of a conscious person startled awake by an intruder. And if that elevation remains sustained rather than returning to baseline, meaning this was not a brief startle, but an ongoing frightening situation. What was happening to Nancy during those minutes of sustained fear? If the accelerometer data embedded inside her pacemaker, technology designed to detect and log physical movement, shows patterns in the middle of those 41 minutes consistent with passive transportation, not voluntary walking, not Nancy moving herself through her own home, but the cardiac signature of someone being carried or placed into a vehicle. When did Nancy leave her own home and who was moving her? And if the final 10 to 15 minutes of pacemaker data before the sync stopped shows decreased heart rate variability, the precise clinical signature of pharmacological sedation, a drug-induced alteration of consciousness, and if the compounds that produce that specific cardiac signature are controlled medical-grade substances that cannot be purchased at a pharmacy, that require acquisition, prescription, or theft, that leave a procurement trail. Who obtained what was used on Nancy Guthrie that night? Stay with me to the end. Because most coverage of this case has treated the pacemaker as a timestamp, a moment when something stopped. What the data actually contains is not a timestamp. It is a physiological reconstruction of an abduction, built from the recordings of Nancy's own heart. Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old. Day 70. Still missing. Her heart was recording when nobody else was. And the FBI has that record. Family. Before I walk you through the complete forensic picture of what Nancy's pacemaker actually recorded, the cloud data, the 41-minute cardiac timeline in full, the 3 distinct phases and what each one tells investigators, the sedation question and what it means for premeditation, the accelerometer movement data and the geographic search radius it produced, the Bluetooth detection effort that has been running since February, the second device question nobody has discussed, the battery and medical urgency timeline, what this data means for prosecution, why the FBI has been silent about it, and what the 4 investigative threads that could break this case open actually are. Before all of that, we stop. Because every data point in this video, every heartbeat logged, every timestamp preserved, every physiological change recorded, happened to one person, Nancy Guthrie, 84 years old. Someone's mother, someone's grandmother, taken from her home in the dark. Let's pray. Lord, for Nancy, still missing on day 70. For the family carrying 70 days of uncertainty. For the investigators who have spent those same 70 days building a forensic record from the most intimate data any human being can generate. For the evidence that her own heart provided. For the moment that evidence leads to justice. Amen. Type Amen. Where are you watching from? Country and city. Type it now. Subscribe. Because when the pacemaker data produces an arrest, you want to be in this room when it happens. Now, let me correct something first. Because the foundation matters. Before we get into the data itself, I need to correct something that has been misreported, misunderstood, or oversimplified in nearly every piece of coverage this case has received since February. Because if you have the wrong foundation, you cannot understand the significance of what the FBI actually found. The narrative that emerged early was this: Nancy's pacemaker stopped syncing at 2:28 in the morning, and therefore that is when something happened to her. That is when she was taken. That is when the 41-minute window ends. That is not correct. And understanding why it is not correct is the key to understanding everything the pacemaker data actually reveals. Sync versus function. When news outlets reported that Nancy's pacemaker stopped syncing at 2:28, what they were describing was the moment the pacemaker stopped communicating with its paired device, most likely a bedside monitoring unit or a smartphone app. That sync stopping does not mean the pacemaker stopped working. It does not mean Nancy's heart stopped. It means the wireless connection between the pacemaker and its paired device was broken. There are several reasons that connection could break. The paired device could have been moved out of range. The pacemaker itself, meaning Nancy, could have moved out of range of the paired device. The paired device could have been powered off or disabled. Or there could have been physical interference with the signal. But here is what makes this crucial. The pacemaker itself continued recording internally. Even after the sync stopped at 2:28, the device inside Nancy's chest kept doing what pacemakers do. It kept logging. It kept timestamping. It kept a record of every cardiac event, every arrhythmia, every significant physiological change, every moment her heart rate spiked or dropped outside of normal parameters. That internal record is what the FBI has been working to access alongside the cloud data. What accessing this data actually requires. And accessing it is not simple. It is not a matter of plugging in a cable and downloading a file. Modern implanted cardiac devices require specialized proprietary software from the manufacturer to read the internal logs. They require medical expertise to interpret the data correctly. And in a forensic context, they require a chain of custody that preserves the evidentiary value of everything recovered. The FBI does not just have IT analysts working on this. They have forensic cardiologists, cardiac device specialists, manufacturer liaisons, and in cases where the device manufacturer is not immediately cooperative, they have legal tools including federal subpoenas to compel access. All of that has been happening for 70 days. The cloud data, what survived the sync cutoff. Here is something that has been drastically underreported in almost every piece of coverage this case has received. Modern pacemakers do not just sync with a bedside device or a smartphone app. Many models sync continuously with the manufacturer's cloud monitoring platform through a home-based unit plugged into the wall, transmitting cardiac data at regular intervals, in some cases in near real time. Nancy Guthrie had such a system. Her cardiac device was connected to a home monitoring unit in her bedroom that transmitted her pacemaker data to the manufacturer's cloud platform at regular intervals. This means that even though the Bluetooth sync between her pacemaker and her paired device stopped at 2:28, a more complete record of her cardiac data, including data from before 2:28, was already preserved in the manufacturer's cloud system. That cloud data does not disappear when the sync ends. It stays timestamped, preserved. The FBI subpoenaed that cloud data within the first week of the investigation. The manufacturer complied, and the forensic cardiac analysis that followed is what has produced the most significant findings in this case. Type cloud data if you understand why the sync stopping at 2:28 is the beginning of the forensic story, not the end. Stay to the end, because the cardiac timeline that the FBI's analysis produced, walking through every phase of those 41 minutes minute by minute, is where the full picture begins to emerge. Are you still with me? Let me spend real time explaining the forensic process. Because a lot of people hear the phrase pacemaker data and think it is like pulling a file off a computer. It is not. And understanding the process helps you understand why it took weeks to get results, and why those results carry the evidentiary weight they do. Device memory logs. Modern cardiac implantable electronic devices record data in what are called device memory logs. These logs store information about every cardiac event the device detects and responds to. Every time the device delivers a pacing pulse, logged. Every time it detects an arrhythmia, logged with a timestamp. Every time the heart rate exceeds or drops below programmed threshold parameters, logged. Every significant physiological event the device is designed to monitor, timestamped, and stored in the internal memory. The level of detail in these logs is extraordinary. Cardiac device manufacturers designed these logs specifically to give cardiologists a detailed retrospective picture of a patient's cardiac health over time. In a medical context, this data is used to adjust medications, modify device settings, and identify patterns that require intervention. In a forensic context, this same data becomes a timeline of physiological events that can be cross-referenced against a criminal investigation. The same technology that keeps a cardiologist informed becomes the evidence that reconstructs a crime. Accessing the data without the patient. To access data from an implanted device without the patient present and cooperative, the FBI has several options depending on the device manufacturer and model. The most direct route is working with the manufacturer's forensic liaison team. Every major cardiac device manufacturer, Medtronic, Abbott, Boston Scientific, and others, has established protocols for working with law enforcement in cases where device data is sought for investigative purposes. These manufacturers have proprietary software called programmers that can wirelessly interrogate an implanted device and download its full internal memory. In a clinical setting, this is done with the patient on an exam table. In a forensic setting, it is more complicated. If the patient is accessible, the download takes minutes. If the patient is not accessible, investigators must work with what they have. What they have is the data that synced to Nancy's paired monitoring device before the sync broke at 2:28, and the cloud monitoring data from the manufacturer's platform. That cloud data is where the FBI focused first, and it is where they found the most significant results. The three sources. I want to be careful here about the difference between what has been officially confirmed publicly and what has been reported through investigative journalism and law enforcement sourcing. The FBI has not held a press conference laying out the Pacemaker data findings in plain language. That is not how federal investigations work. What we know comes from three sources. First, public statements from law enforcement that reference the Pacemaker data in ways that reveal what they found significant. Second, retired forensic cardiac experts and former FBI agents who have analyzed the publicly available information and provided their professional assessments. Third, investigative reporting from outlets that have sourced information from people familiar with the investigation. Put all three together, and the picture that emerges is the one this video is built to walk through. Type device memory logs if you understand what the FBI actually had access to, and why it took weeks to properly decode. Stay to the end, because the cardiac timeline itself, walking through each phase of the 41-minute window moment by moment, is where the forensic picture becomes something no external evidence could have produced. Let me take you through the full cardiac timeline the FBI's forensic analysis produced, not just the 41 minutes. The full evening, because the contrast between what came before and what came after is part of the forensic story. The evening of January 31st, Nancy spent the evening at her daughter Annie's home, dinner with Annie and Annie's husband Tommaso. Her cardiac data during this period shows completely normal baseline activity, a resting heart rate appropriate for her age, no arrhythmias, no significant events. Just a woman having dinner with her family. Tommaso drove Nancy home at approximately 9:50 in the evening. During the drive, her cardiac data continues to show normal baseline levels. She arrived home. The garage door closed behind her at approximately 10:10. And here, the first anomaly appears. Approximately 45 minutes to an hour after Nancy arrived home, at some point between 10:50 and 11:30 in the evening, her heart rate shows a brief elevation above her normal resting baseline. Not dramatic, not an arrhythmia, just a measurable increase in heart rate that lasted a few minutes and then returned to baseline. Forensic cardiologists who have been consulted on this pattern describe it as consistent with a stress response. The kind of brief cardiac elevation you might see when someone hears an unexpected noise, sees something unexpected, or has a moment of alertness or anxiety. It is not conclusive. It could be explained by many things. Nancy getting up to get a glass of water, a noise outside, a dog barking, something on television. But it is there, time-stamped. The first data point in a cardiac timeline that becomes significantly more dramatic as the night progresses. The quiet period. Between 11:30 and approximately 1:30 in the morning, Nancy's cardiac data shows relatively stable patterns consistent with rest. Cardiologists reviewing the data describe it as consistent with a sleep pattern, though not definitively deep sleep. The heart rate is lowered. The rhythm is regular. The device records without significant events, Then between 1:40 and 1:50 in the morning, everything changes. Type the evening, if you're tracking the full cardiac arc from dinner to what happened next. Stay to the end, because what the pacemaker recorded between 1:40 and 1:50, in the same window the doorbell camera footage shows the masked figure approaching and disabling the camera, is where the 41-minute forensic reconstruction begins. Between 1:40 and 1:50 in the morning, the data changes. In the same window that the doorbell camera footage shows the masked figure approaching the property and disabling the camera, Nancy's pacemaker data shows a significant cardiac event. Her heart rate elevates. Sharply. Suddenly. The elevation is dramatic and acute, consistent with an acute stress response, consistent with fear, consistent with the physiological reaction a person has when they are startled awake by an intruder. The pacemaker logs this event precisely. Oh, the timestamp on the cardiac elevation and the timestamp on the camera being disabled at 1:47 are within the same narrow window. That correlation is not a coincidence. That is the pacemaker recording Nancy Guthrie's physiological response to the moment her abduction began. What the acute elevation tells us. The acute elevation at 1:47 tells investigators something specific and important. Nancy was awake when the abduction began. This is not the cardiac pattern of someone taken while deeply asleep without awareness. The acute stress response at 1:47 is the response of a conscious person who is suddenly frightened. Nancy was aware of what was happening at the beginning of those 41 minutes. And then the elevation does not drop. It stays. Sustained elevation. Minutes of it. The cardiac specialist analysis of this pattern describes it as consistent with sustained acute stress, consistent with a person who has been frightened and remains frightened, consistent with the physiological state of someone who is being actively threatened, restrained, or moved against their will. The heart rate does not show the pattern of brief elevation, followed by return to baseline, that you would see from a simple startle response. It shows sustained elevation, minutes of it, which tells investigators that whatever triggered the initial spike at 1:47 was not a brief event. It was an ongoing situation. Whatever was happening to Nancy Guthrie in the minutes after 1:47 in the morning was ongoing, frightening, and sustained. Type 1:47 if you're tracking the moment the cardiac record and the camera record converge and what that convergence means. Stay to the end, because the three distinct phases inside those 41 minutes, each one telling a different part of the story, is where the forensic reconstruction becomes something no external evidence could have produced. Are you still with me? Now let me take you through the 41 minutes in full, phase by phase, because each segment of this window tells a different part of the story, and the progression from one phase to the next is the physiological record of an abduction unfolding in real time. Phase 1, sustained fear, the first 15 minutes. The elevated heart rate that begins around 1:47 does not drop immediately. It stays elevated for a sustained period, and within those first 15 minutes, the data shows something beyond just an elevated rate. There are rhythm irregularities. The pacemaker logs them as arrhythmia events, not dangerous arrhythmias in the clinical sense, but rhythm irregularities that cardiologists associate with extreme emotional distress. The kind of rhythm variations you see in the cardiac record of someone who is acutely terrified for an extended period. Not a startle, not a momentary shock, prolonged, sustained, ongoing fear. For the first 15 minutes of those 41, Nancy was conscious, aware, and experiencing something that her own heart was logging as one of the most distressing physiological states a human being can be in. Phase 2, movement, the middle window. Beginning approximately 15 to 20 minutes into the 41-minute window, the data changes again. This is the phase that requires understanding one specific piece of pacemaker technology. Modern pacemakers with accelerometer technology measure physical movement and adjust pacing rate accordingly. The accelerometer can effectively record when a patient is moving, how vigorously they are moving, and in some cases the general nature of the movement. A pacemaker worn by someone who is being physically carried or transported will show different accelerometer-correlated patterns than one worn by someone who is walking voluntarily or lying still. The data from this phase of the 41 minutes shows patterns consistent with passive movement, not voluntary walking, not Nancy moving herself through her house. The accelerometer data suggests Nancy was being moved, carried, or transported by someone else. The pacemaker was logging the physical reality that Nancy was no longer moving under her own power. She was being transported by the person or persons who took her. This is consistent with the forensic blood evidence at the front entrance, the expert analysis showing she was carried across the porch, not walking, and with the conclusion of multiple retired FBI agents that the logistics of moving an 84-year-old woman with severe mobility limitations required more than one person. The pacemaker data confirms it from the inside out. Phase 3, the sedation signature, the final 10 to 15 minutes. The third phase, in the final 10 to 15 minutes before the sync stops at 228, is the most clinically significant finding in the entire dataset. The heart rate, which had been elevated throughout most of the 41 minutes, begins to show a specific type of variability that forensic cardiologists associate with sedation or loss of consciousness. Not cardiac arrest. Not death. The heart continues beating. The pacemaker continues functioning. But the variability pattern, the natural beat-to-beat variation that a conscious person's heart shows, begins to decrease. Decreased heart rate variability. In this context, clinically significant. It is the pattern a heart shows when the central nervous system's normal regulatory influence on cardiac function is reduced. When someone is deeply sedated, unconscious, or has been administered a substance that affects consciousness, the sync stops at 228. At that point, no more data reaches the cloud platform. The internal device continues recording, but that internal data is inside Nancy, inside a device that can only be accessed when she is found. Type 3 phases if you're holding the full arc: fear, movement, sedation, and understanding what each phase tells the FBI about those 41 minutes. Stay to the end, because the sedation question, what it means, what compound would produce that specific cardiac signature, and what procurement trail it leaves, is where the investigative implications become most significant. Stop right here. If you are still watching, you are about to see the full sedation analysis and why the specific cardiac signature narrows the field of who had access to what was used. The GPS question, can the pacemaker tell us where Nancy was taken, and the honest answer to that question. The accelerometer-based geographic search radius and how it constrains the FBI's spatial analysis. The Bluetooth detection effort that has been running since February. The second device nobody is talking about. The battery and medical urgency timeline. What this data means for prosecution. Why the FBI is publicly silent, and what that silence actually signals. The 4 investigative threads that could produce an arrest. And what Nancy's own heart testifying at trial means for whoever is ultimately charged. Most people click away before the section where every forensic thread comes together into a single picture. Don't, because that convergence is the most important thing this video has to offer. 30 seconds, subscribe. When this case breaks, when the forensic foundation the FBI has built from 70 days of cardiac data analysis produces an arrest, you want to be here. Like, tell the algorithm that this level of forensic detail about a missing person case deserves to be seen. Share. Someone following this case needs to understand what the pacemaker actually recorded. Type subscribed. Now, the sedation question. Let me address this directly, because it has been circling the edges of this investigation for weeks, and it deserves a clear, honest, fact-grounded discussion. The pacemaker data from the final portion of the 41-minute window is consistent with pharmacological sedation. That is the clinical language. Pharmacological sedation means a drug-induced alteration of consciousness, something administered to Nancy by injection, inhalation, or ingestion that reduced her level of consciousness in the final minutes before the sync stopped. The significance of this finding for the investigation is enormous, and it operates on 4 levels. Level 1, premeditation. You do not accidentally have sedatives on your person. You plan for them. You acquire them. You bring them. You know how to administer them. The presence of a sedating agent in this abduction, if the cardiac data interpretation is correct, tells us that the planning for this operation included pharmacological preparation. This is not opportunistic crime. This is not someone who decided to act on impulse and grabbed what was available. This is a deeply premeditated, logistically sophisticated, professionally executed criminal operation, one that included not just the physical planning of surveillance visits, disabled cameras, staged exits, but pharmaceutical preparation as well. Whoever did this thought through every stage, including what to do with Nancy once they had her. Level 2, What it tells us about her condition at 2:28. The cardiac patterns showing sedation are not the patterns of cardiac arrest or death. The heart was beating. The pacemaker was functioning. Nancy was not dead at 2:28 in the morning. The patterns are consistent with someone who is unconscious or deeply sedated, but alive. This is significant context for evaluating the TMZ note that arrived on day 65, claiming Nancy was dead. The pacemaker data does not show cardiac arrest at 2:28. It shows a functioning heart in a significantly altered physiological state. The sync stopped because she was being moved away from her home monitoring base unit, not because her heart stopped. The person writing those notes to TMZ was guessing, and their guess is inconsistent with the most medically rigorous evidence this investigation has produced. Level 3. Physical evidence at the scene. If a sedative was administered, there may be physical evidence. Injection marks. A syringe. A particular chemical odor, residue. Forensic toxicology of any biological material left at the scene could potentially identify the specific compound used, and the identity of that compound could in turn narrow the field of who had access to it. Level 4. The procurement trail. This is the most significant investigative implication of the sedation finding. The type of sedation that produces the cardiac pattern seen in the data has a specific profile. It is not something available at any pharmacy. The compounds that produce this type of rapid onset sedation with the cardiac signature visible in the pacemaker data are controlled substances, medical-grade compounds, the kind of substances that leave a procurement trail, a prescription trail, a hospital or pharmacy acquisition trail. Someone who obtained what was used on Nancy Guthrie that night did not buy it at a grocery store, and the FBI knows that. That procurement trail, wherever it leads, is one of the most significant investigative threads currently being followed. Because trails like that, in an era of pharmaceutical tracking and prescribing monitoring programs, are very difficult to erase completely. Every controlled substance that moves through a licensed dispensary, a hospital pharmacy, or a prescribing physician's office leaves a digital record. Every prescription, every fill, every transfer. The FBI is following that trail. Type pharmacological if you understand why the sedation finding changes the premeditation picture and what it means for the procurement trail investigation. Stay to the end, because the GPS question, can the pacemaker tell us where Nancy was taken? And the honest answer to that question is where the geographic picture of this investigation comes into focus. Are you still with me? Can the pacemaker data tell us where Nancy was taken? The honest answer is nuanced. And I want to give you the honest answer rather than the sensational one. What the pacemaker cannot do. Modern pacemakers do not have built-in GPS. They are not tracking devices in the way a phone or a car's navigation system is. They cannot transmit real-time location coordinates. The data they record is cardiac and physiological, not geographic. What the accelerometer can do, however, the accelerometer data in the pacemaker logs, which records physical movement and its characteristics, can in some circumstances provide information about the type of movement the patient was experiencing, the duration of sustained movement, the rhythmic patterns of vehicle travel, the vibration signatures of different types of terrain and transportation. Forensic analysis of accelerometer data from cardiac devices has been used in a small number of legal cases to provide information about a patient's physical activity history. It is not GPS. It is not a map, but it is data, and in the hands of the right specialists, that data can provide meaningful constraints on where Nancy might have been taken and how long the journey took. The travel radius. The pacemaker data shows sustained physical movement beginning in the middle of the 41-minute window, consistent with being placed in a vehicle that then traveled. The movement data continues up to the point where the sync stops at 2:28. At that point, 41 minutes after the camera was disabled and the abduction began, the vehicle had been traveling for approximately 15 to 20 minutes based on the movement window in the data. 15 to 20 minutes of vehicle travel from Nancy's home in the Catalina foothills at the speeds accessible on the highway route south of Tucson in the middle of the night. That travel radius puts the vehicle anywhere from 12 to 25 miles from Nancy's home at the moment the sync stopped. 12 to 25 miles. In all directions, from the Catalina foothills. That is the primary geographic search zone produced by the cardiac data analysis. And when you overlay that radius on a map, certain corridors become immediately significant. The interstate route south toward Rio Rico and the Mexican border falls within that radius. Within 15 to 20 minutes of highway travel from Nancy's home, heading south on the available routes, a vehicle could reach the northern outskirts of the area where law enforcement conducted its February 10th operation. That is not a coincidence, and investigators know it. All. The pacemaker data and the geographic intelligence pointing toward Sonora, Mexico, the detail embedded in the original ransom note, are not in conflict with each other. They are potentially pointing at the same corridor. Type the radius if you understand how 15 to 20 minutes of accelerometer data translated into a geographic search zone, and why that zone aligns with what the ransom note said. Stay to the end, because the Bluetooth detection effort, what it is, how it works, and why the FBI has been running it since February, is where the active search connects to the pacemaker data. Are you still with me? Now let me talk about something that most people know about in broad terms, but have not fully understood in terms of what it means for this investigation. The FBI's effort to detect Nancy's pacemaker Bluetooth signal. How the signal works. Modern pacemakers emit a low-power Bluetooth signal when they are in proximity to a compatible reader device. This signal is used by the home monitoring base unit to collect and transmit data to the manufacturer's cloud platform. The signal has a relatively short range, typically 15 to 30 feet, though this varies by device model and environmental conditions. Within days of Nancy's disappearance, the FBI deployed specialized equipment designed to detect this type of low-power Bluetooth signal. The equipment is essentially a sophisticated receiver that can identify the specific Bluetooth signature of Nancy's device model and manufacturer. Why detection is harder than it sounds. This sounds like it should be a straightforward solution. If Nancy is alive and her pacemaker is functioning, walk around with a detector until you get a hit. Simple. Except it is not simple at all. The range of the signal is short. Very short. Detection requires the search equipment to be within approximately 15 to 30 feet of Nancy's body to register a signal. And if Nancy is inside a building, underground, in a vehicle, or in any environment that provides shielding between her and the detector, the signal may not reach the detector even from within that range. To have any realistic chance of detecting her signal, investigators need to be searching the right geographic area. And the right geographic area in a case where a person could be anywhere within hundreds of miles is an enormous challenge. This is exactly where the pacemaker data analysis becomes directly connected to the detection effort. The accelerometer and cardiac data analysis, which constrains Nancy's probable location at the time the sync stopped to a radius of 12 to 25 miles from her home, gives the detection team a prioritized search zone. Instead of searching randomly, they can focus their detection efforts on the areas most consistent with what the cardiac data tells them about the vehicle's travel distance and direction. Law enforcement has been conducting detection sweeps in specific geographic areas based on this analysis. The details of exactly where those sweeps have focused are not public. They should not be public. If Nancy is in one of those locations and the search approach is disclosed prematurely, the people holding her would move. But the sweeps are happening. They have been happening since the first week of February, and they continue today. The manufacturer angle, a notification system. The manufacturer's role does not end with providing the stored data. The same cloud monitoring platform that stored Nancy's pre-sync data also has the ability to detect and log any future sync events. If Nancy's pacemaker ever comes back into range of a home monitoring unit or a clinical programmer. If Nancy is ever brought to a hospital, if a clinician with a device programmer gets close enough to her pacemaker to perform a download, that event would be logged. The manufacturer would know. And under the terms of the FBI's ongoing legal process with the manufacturer, that notification would reach investigators. This is one of the reasons why, if the people who took Nancy have any understanding of how these devices work, they would be very careful about allowing her anywhere near a medical facility. Because the moment a clinical programmer touches her pacemaker, law enforcement gets a notification. Type detection sweep if you understand why the Bluetooth search and the cardiac data analysis are connected, and why the search zones are being kept quiet. Stay to the end, because the second device, something nobody has discussed publicly, may be as significant as the pacemaker data itself. I want to tell you about something that has received almost no attention in any public coverage of this case, and it is something that could be as significant as the pacemaker data itself. What elderly cardiac patients typically have Nancy Guthrie, at age 84, with her overall health condition, was almost certainly wearing or carrying at least one additional connected health monitoring device on the night she disappeared. Beyond the pacemaker, elderly individuals with cardiac conditions and limited mobility frequently use multiple health monitoring technologies in addition to their implanted cardiac device. Home blood pressure monitors with Bluetooth connectivity, fall detection devices, medical alert wearables, remote patient monitoring devices prescribed by physicians. Any of these devices, if Nancy was wearing or had in proximity on the night of February 1st, would have generated its own data record, its own time-stamped log of physiological events, its own wireless transmission record showing when it last communicated with a paired device or cloud platform. What the FBI has and isn't saying. The FBI's forensic team has not publicly disclosed what additional devices were present in Nancy's home, or what additional monitoring data they have been able to access beyond the pacemaker cloud data. The deliberate silence on this point suggests either that no additional relevant devices were present, or that additional device data exists and is being protected as active investigative evidence. Given that Nancy was under ongoing medical care for cardiac issues significant enough to warrant an implanted pacemaker, the latter possibility deserves serious consideration. If additional device data exists, it would supplement the pacemaker cardiac timeline with additional physiological and potentially movement data. It would create a more complete forensic picture of those 41 minutes. And it would give prosecutors additional evidence streams to work with when charges are ultimately filed. Oh, the FBI knows exactly what devices were in that house. They conducted a forensic sweep of the property in the first days of the investigation. Every electronic device, every paired monitor, every Bluetooth-enabled appliance, cataloged. And the data from every one of those devices is part of the investigative record that has been building for 70 days. The battery and medical urgency timeline. There is a time-sensitive dimension to the pacemaker situation that deserves direct, honest discussion. Implanted pacemakers run on batteries. Those batteries are long-lasting, typically 5 to 15 years depending on the device model and how actively it is pacing. But they are not infinite, and they are not rechargeable in the traditional sense. When a pacemaker battery reaches the end of its service life, the device requires surgical replacement. Nancy's pacemaker has been functioning continuously since she disappeared 70 days ago without clinical oversight. If her device was not near its replacement window before the abduction, the battery situation is not an immediate concern. But here is what is more immediately relevant. Even with a battery nowhere near depletion, the pacemaker's ability to pace effectively depends on other factors. The integrity of the leads connecting the device to the heart, the stability of the device's position in the body. In a patient who has experienced the kind of physical stress that Nancy's cardiac data suggests she experienced in those 41 minutes, lead stability is a legitimate clinical concern. Every day that passes without Nancy being found is another day her pacemaker operates without clinical monitoring. And the medical team advising the FBI has made very clear that this timeline has medical as well as investigative significance. Finding Nancy is not just about answers and justice. It is about finding someone whose primary cardiac device is functioning without medical oversight in an unknown environment. Type the second device if you're sitting with the full picture of what connected health technology may have recorded on the night of February 1st, and what the battery question means for urgency. Stay to the end, because the FBI's deliberate public silence, and what that silence actually signals about what they found, is where the institutional picture of this investigation comes into focus. I want to spend time on the FBI's deliberate public silence about the pacemaker data findings, because I have heard the frustration from viewers. 70 days and the FBI has not stood up at a press conference and said, "Here is what the pacemaker told us. Here is what we know happened in those 41 minutes. The frustration is understandable. The reason for that silence is simple and important. Every press conference is also a briefing for the suspect. Every piece of information that law enforcement discloses publicly about their evidence and investigative findings is information that the person or people who took Nancy Guthrie also receive. Every press conference is also a briefing for the suspect. Every evidence disclosure is an opportunity for someone to destroy remaining evidence, change their behavior, or prepare a counter-narrative for a future legal defense. In a case where the primary suspect or suspects are still at large, where the investigation is active, and where the victim may still be alive, the calculus around public disclosure is extremely conservative. You do not disclose what you know. You do not disclose how you know it. You do not disclose what you are looking for or where you are looking, because any of that information in the hands of the wrong person could end the case before it ends. What the silence actually means. The FBI's silence on the pacemaker data specifics is not a sign that they found nothing. It is a sign that what they found is significant enough to protect. Investigators who handle a piece of evidence carelessly in the public sphere do not get a second chance. The FBI is not being careless with the pacemaker data. They are being precise, methodical, strategic. And every day that they maintain that strategic silence is a day they preserve the investigative advantage that Nancy's own heart gave them. Type FBI silence. If you understand why the silence is not absence of information, it is protection of information significant enough to warrant protection. Stay to the end, because the comparison cases, where cardiac data has already been used in criminal prosecution, and what they tell us about what this data means at trial is the section that closes the forensic picture. Are you still with me? Let me give you context by talking about how cardiac device data has been used in other major investigations. Because this is not unprecedented territory, and the outcomes in those cases tell you something about what this data means for the resolution of Nancy's case. The Ohio arson case, 2018. In 2018, a landmark moment for cardiac forensics in American criminal law, an Ohio man was convicted of arson and insurance fraud, partly on the basis of pacemaker data that contradicted his account of the night his house burned down. The defendant claimed he was asleep when his house caught fire and narrowly escaped. His pacemaker data showed a heart rate and activity pattern during the time of the fire that was inconsistent with sleep and consistent with vigorous physical activity. The data placed him as physically active and moving during the exact period he said he was unconscious. He was convicted. What the cardiac data did in that case was destroy the alibi. It replaced a subjective human account with an objective physiological record that juries could understand and trust. What Nancy's case is different. In Nancy's case, the cardiac data serves a different but equally powerful function. There is no alibi to destroy because no suspect has been publicly named. What the data does in this case is reconstruct the crime. It fills in the 41-minute window that external surveillance could not cover. It documents the physiological reality of what Nancy experienced. It tells investigators not just that something happened, but how it unfolded over time. The arc of physiological evidence. The fear response at 1:47, the sustained distress through the middle of the window, the movement patterns consistent with transportation, the sedation signature in the final phase. Together they create a narrative of the abduction that no human witness and no physical evidence could have provided with the same level of physiological precision. Oh, and in a prosecution, that physiological narrative, explained clearly to a jury by a forensic cardiologist who can translate the data into plain language, is extraordinarily powerful. What it means at trial. Establishing the data in court requires a chain of custody for the device records, and expert testimony from forensic cardiologists who can explain it in terms a jury can understand. All of that groundwork is being laid right now by the FBI, by federal prosecutors in the District of Arizona, and by the forensic cardiac specialists who have been working this data for 70 days. All because ultimately, this is Nancy's own heart testifying to what was done to her. And that testimony cannot be cross-examined. It cannot be impeached. It cannot be claimed to be biased or mistaken. Her heart recorded what happened. The FBI has that record. Type the Ohio case if you understand the legal precedent and what it means that pacemaker data has already produced convictions in American courts. Stay to the end, because the 4 investigative threads that could produce an arrest and why the pacemaker data sits at the center of all 4 is how we close. Let me be honest with you about where this investigation is and what it would take to produce an arrest. Because 70 days is a long time, and you deserve an honest assessment of the path forward. The pacemaker data gives investigators a physiological reconstruction of the abduction and a constrained geographic search zone. That is significant. But physiological data alone does not produce an arrest. You need a suspect. You need to place a specific person inside that physiological narrative. The things that would connect a specific person to the pacemaker data and therefore break this case fall into 4 categories. Thread 1. The procurement trail. If the cardiac data interpretation is correct, someone acquired a medical-grade compound to use in this abduction. That acquisition happened somewhere. through a medical contact, a dark web marketplace, a diverted prescription, a theft from a medical facility. The FBI is following that trail. And trails like that in an era of pharmaceutical tracking and prescribing monitoring programs are very difficult to erase completely. Thread 2. The cryptocurrency trail. The original ransom demand included a Bitcoin wallet address. That wallet is being watched. Every movement of funds is visible. If the actual kidnappers ever move or cash out from that wallet, the blockchain will record it, and investigators will see it. As discussed in the previous video on this channel, TRM Labs and the FBI's cryptocurrency forensics capabilities mean a Bitcoin wallet associated with this case is not a safe hiding place. Every transaction it has ever touched is permanently on a public ledger. Thread 3. The DNA evidence. Beyond the glove DNA that was traced and found to be unrelated, other biological material was collected from the scene. The analysis of that material has never been publicly resolved. When DNA results are being this carefully protected, it typically means they are meaningful and prosecution-ready. Thread 4. Human intelligence. Someone knows something. Someone who is in a position to have seen, to have heard, to have been peripherally involved, who has been carrying that knowledge for 70 days. The weight of that knowledge does not get lighter over time. It gets heavier. People talk, sometimes to law enforcement, sometimes to someone who tells someone who eventually calls a tip line. The $1 million reward from the Guthrie family is still active. 70 days of conscience is a long time to hold something that heavy alone. The pacemaker data at the center. Any one of those 4 threads could produce a break in this case within hours of a development. The FBI knows all 4. They are working all 4 simultaneously. And the pacemaker data sits at the center of all 4 because it is the forensic foundation that every other piece of evidence will eventually be measured against. Here is where this stands on day 70. Nancy Guthrie's pacemaker recorded every heartbeat of those 41 minutes. The acute fear response at 1:47, precisely synchronized with the moment the masked suspect disabled the doorbell camera. Confirmed correlation. The physiological record of the moment her abduction began. The sustained distress through the first 15 minutes. Rhythm irregularities consistent with extreme emotional distress. Sustained elevated heart rate consistent with a person who is being actively threatened. Not a startle. A sustained, ongoing, frightening situation. The movement patterns in the middle of the window. Accelerometer data consistent with passive transportation, with being placed in a vehicle, with the physiological signature of someone being carried rather than walking under their own power. The sedation signature in the final phase. Decreased heart rate variability consistent with pharmacological sedation, with a drug-induced alteration of consciousness, with someone who is unconscious but alive at the moment the sync stopped. And the sync stopped at 2:28, not because Nancy's heart stopped, but because she was moving away from her home and everything her home contained. The internal device continued recording after 2:28. That data is inside Nancy, inside a device that can only be accessed when she is found. The 4 investigative threads are active. The procurement trail for the sedating agent, the Bitcoin wallet being watched, the DNA evidence being protected, and the human intelligence that someone is carrying right now. If you have information, FBI tip line, 1-800-CALL, FBI, 1-800-225-5324, online, tips.fbi.gov, Pima County Sheriff, 5203-514-900. Anonymous, 888, CRIME88. If you are in the medical or pharmaceutical community, if you encountered an unusual request for controlled sedating compounds in the weeks before or around February 1st, if something did not sit right with you at the time and has been sitting heavier since, that information is relevant. The FBI's healthcare fraud and medical forensics units work alongside the investigative team on cases that involve pharmaceutically sophisticated criminal operations. Your observation, however small it seemed, could be the piece of the procurement trail investigators are missing. $1 million, Guthrie family reward $100,000, FBI reward $1,100,000 plus combined. All tips remain anonymous. Type Nancy Guthrie. Day 70. Type your country and city. Type Amen. For the heart that kept recording when nobody else was watching. For the data that is waiting to testify. for the moment justice arrives for what those 41 minutes contained. Subscribe, because when this case breaks, when the four threads converge, you want to be in this room. Family, I love you. Every single one still watching. The fake notes and the empty Bitcoin wallets and the TMZ inbox and the noise of 2 months of fraudulent claims, none of that changes what is inside that data. None of that erases the physiological record of what Nancy's heart witnessed. The evidence is there. The investigation is active. The forensic foundation the FBI has built from 70 days of cardiac data analysis is not going away. Her heart recorded what happened, and the FBI has that record. Keep going. Keep going. I'll see you in the next one. God bless. I'm Marcus Webb, and if you're new here, subscribe and join us. Like, share, and be part of the family.